So I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers today. Barbara Teller Ornelas and Lynda Teller Pete are fifth-generation weavers who grew up at the fabled Two Gray Hills trading post in New Mexico. They're known for weaving tapestries in the traditional Two Gray Hills pattern, identified primarily by a double diamond layout and intricate geometric designs made with natural colored, hand-carded, and hand-spun wool. Barbara has also won 2 Best of Show awards at the prestigious Santa Fe Indian Market. In this presentation, Lynda and Barbara will briefly introduce the history of Navajo weaving, focusing on their family's process of weaving from sheep to tapestry. They'll also discuss making their most recent book, Spider-Woman's Children, Navajo Weavers Today, which was just published last week, which offers a glimpse into the lives of weavers of all ages and experiences across different communities on and off the Navajo Nation. And on a more personal note, I first met Lynda and Barbara during my dissertation research when I took one of their weaving workshops. So in addition to being 2 of the most skilled Navajo weavers working today, they're also incredibly kind and patient and generous teachers. So it's an honor to have them with us. Thank you. And I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Yeah, Barbara Teller Ornelas Cynthia. Deja Lynda Wolia. By need don't go ahead, Lini Bashichin. Had the Gani than him Ashin than Hiche. Did us Salini. That's so that did Ash Adon Kimbalon Hije a Samuel Teller Wolia.
Good morning, afternoon. What my sister Barbara said is right there on the board. We are both born to Water's Edge people. We have 4 clans that we identify ourselves with. Born to the Water's Edge people is our mother. She's the one that we get our first clan from. And then we are born for our father, which is the 2 rivers that flow together. And then we have to identify our maternal grandfather and our paternal grandfather. And that's just how Navajos introduce themselves, and it's also a way for not marrying into your own clans, which makes it really hard to date. And I had to go from the Navajo Nation to Denver, where I met my husband Melvin, who I had just moved to Denver too, and by the time we met, we were fairly sure we didn't have 2 clans together. Well, thank you so much for coming to our talk. My sister and I have been we are 5th generation weavers, and we've grew up on the Navajo Nation, and we live behind the Two Gray Hills trading post, and that trading post recently closed. It's open by appointment only, but it's such a sad ending. But as we go into the talk, we'll let you know about the trading post style, the trading post trend that is now, I think, coming to an end on the Navajo Nation. So we introduced ourselves, and in our family, and there are a lot more families out there on the Navajo Nation and off the nation that are weavers. And in our family, we have Barbara and me, her children, Sierra and Michael, and we had an older sister named Roseanne, and her grandchild is Roxanne. She's a weaver, and she is 17 years old. And we also have tool makers in our family. Belvin is also from a weaving family, and he has made tools since he was a kid. So he continues to make tools for us, including, doing his own job. And then our nephew Terry Lee, who's the father of Roxanne, he's one of our tool makers. And one thing we stress is that when we have tools, if people go to like a store to buy tools and the tool makers don't have weavers in their family, a lot of those tools are for decorative functions. And so we stress that if our students buy tools, they have to buy tools that have weavers in their families so that they have been tested. So we start out with 7 generations of weavers in our family. Sadly, we lost our mom in 2014, so Barbara and I have become the elders in our family, which is a strange thing for me to say, considering I'm the last child of our family, and for years and years I wasn't an elder, so it's really weird for me to say I'm an elder now.
Yeah, the bottom right is my daughter Sierra. She's a great weaver, but she's also a writer on a TV show, and she lives in Los Angeles. She was a writer on Happy Endings and Superstore, and she was an executive producer on Superstore, and now she's working on a different show called Splitting Up Together, and it's on ABC. Everybody watch. And but she got a degree in media arts, and she interned at NBI in DC. And but she always, even though she's a writer, she keeps a loom in her office, and so whenever she runs out of ideas, she weaves a little bit, and then she remembers what she wants to do. So she's keeping her tradition alive by weaving stories and weaving pieces. And then my son is Michael, and he's got a degree in computer science, and he's a great weaver. I never really intended to teach him, but when he was 11, he came to me and he says, I wanted to learn. You know, and when I was a kid, I remember my grandmother telling me that you were born to be a weaver. You were given the gift of weaving from the weaving gods, and I just fluffed it off like I didn't believe any of that. But when I saw him take to weaving, like how I took to weaving as a child, I totally understood what is being said. And he designs websites and stuff like that, but his main passion is weaving, and he's getting very good at his designs and skills.
And then the little girl to my right, that's Roxanne, and we started her weaving when she was about 4. Between 4 and 6 years old is when she started weaving, and she's a really good weaver, and she's fearless. You know, when we talk to her about the style that she wants to weave, and we say, yeah, it's a little bit challenging, we're gonna do it this way, and she goes, no, I can do it, it looks easy. Oh, you know, it just it's amazing to me how the younger people are very fearless in what they do, and I think that for a long time, when Barbara and I learned under our mom and under our older sister, we were sort of suppressed in a way, but it was a good way, because what we learned with the suppression was quality control. What we learned was good color combinations, and that's something that no one can just pick up. It has to go through years and years and years of studying, and so we're glad we had that. And with her, and of course with Sierra and Michael, we sort of let them do what they want, but every now and then we'll rein in the order that you guys have to weave a 2-gray, because that's what we're known for and that's where we're from. So I think the combination of both really make them great weavers. So in our family, our first generation was Asata Bahe, and from her we don't have Bosco Redondo stories. And I'll get into the Bosco Redondo, which is part of the history part, but she probably lived around the mid or late 1800s. And she's our first documented weaver in our family. Our second generation and our third are our grandmothers, Susie Tom on my left here, and on my right is her mother, Dinetsu Ibitse. And they were collaborative weavers. So the rug that you see behind them, that's a huge rug with color in it. And that was probably woven past 1940. We're thinking between 1920 to about 1940 is when they wove it. And that was when the 2-gray heel design was still evolving. And our maternal grandmother, our paternal grandmother is not pictured, but she wove, their economic statuses were really different, where our grandmothers, Susie and Dinetsuibitsit, they had to weave for the family survival. They had to weave to feed their children and to keep their households intact. On our father's side, Nellie Pashlakai Teller, she was of a different economic status, and so she didn't have to sell her weavings. A lot of the weavings that she did for personal weavings, personal gifts for all her children, her grandchildren, and a lot of saddle blankets, a lot of functional stuff. And so, circumstances are usually what comes into play in a weaver's life. And for a long time, our mother, Ruth Teller, the one that's pictured on the right, and on the left, and on the right is her sister, Margaret, and then another sister named Mary Louise, who's the youngest of the three. They all knew how to shear the sheep, get the wool off, card it, spin it. So we learned how to process our own wool from really young age. And sadly, both aunts have their sheep herds have dwindled, and so now Barbara and I rely on buying roving from wool festivals because we can't go home and get wool like we used to. But we still insist on doing a lot of the handwork ourselves by spinning. Barbara does most of the spinning. She does the spinning for all the weavers in the family. Our mother, for a long time, this was our second source of income, because on the Navajo Nation, unemployment is really high, but we were one of the lucky ones that our father had a job. So with our mother's weaving, a lot of us were able to do things that weren't afforded a lot of people that live on the Navajo Nation. She put me through college, and she made sure that each one of us left home to go do something productive. And so she did that really well with her weaving. And our mother wove at the Two Great Hills Trading Post. And when tourists would come, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, is when they hear the words Navajo weaving, the picture that comes to mind is of a weaver sitting outside under a tree on the ground weaving. Those are a lot of photo ops, because as photographers came in, they realized they can't take photos inside their houses because their houses are dark. So they make people go outside, there's no chairs out there, so they sit on the ground and weave. And those are a lot of photo ops that happen. And so as tourists came to the Navajo Nation, they would look around and they would say, "Where are all the weavers?" And my dad says, "Probably at home weaving inside their houses." And he would take people to the back of the house, and they would go in and see my mother weaving. And our mother had two dresses behind the door. And Barbara and I, whenever weavers would come to have our mother take photos of their work, she would yell at us, and we would come out, put those dresses on, and we would race outside, and we would stand out there and hold rugs for people. And our mother would take 3 photos. She would take a photo for herself, a photo for the weaver, and a photo to remain with the weaving as it got sold to the trading post. And throughout the years, she documented a lot of weavers and their weavings, and she collected like huge industrial cans, coffee cans of photos. And in her sharp memory days, we would pull a photo out and we'd go, "Who is this, Mom?" And she would know who it was and where, what kind of weaving they had done. And she had an excellent memory until she got into her 80s. And this is our older sister, Roseanne, and we lost her in 1996. I think in all the communities that my sister and I have visited while we were doing this book for 2 years, and in all the stories that we listened to, and I remain biased when I say that she was probably the best weaver I've ever known in my entire life. And she was great when it came to designs. She was great when she came to putting together color combinations. And she was also responsible for the 2 of us to be the weavers we are today. when we were younger, we just kind of thought of her as being bossy. She would come into the room where we were weaving, and she would take a measuring tape and she would say, you guys need to take this out, you know, it's not straight, or the color looks awful, you need to take it out and redo it. And we would just go, oh, you know, and I'm glad she did that, because that's something that you do need discipline in weaving. And this, I'm gonna let Barbara talk about this one.
My older sister Roseanne and I wanted to do something different because Navajo weaving back in the 80s wasn't selling. Nobody, people tend to forget that, you know, there were still Navajo weavings available. And so we decided to do this huge project where it took 5 sheared sheep, and it took us 9 months to prepare the wool. And we had like 5 different shades of brown, 3 different shades of tan, black, 2 different white, 2 different blacks, and 4 different shades of gray in this piece. And it's all natural wool from the sheep. And it took us 2.5 years to weave the project. And every day we would sit in one spot, and then the next day we would switch. And then we would switch back and forth. So the weaving looked like it was done by just one person. And it, we took it to Santa Fe Indian Market, and we were hoping that the Herd Museum would buy it, but they were having a hard time raising funds for it. So I took it to Indian Market, Santa Fe Indian Market, just to see, you know, how it would compete against other art pieces. And 26 out of 28 judges voted for our piece to be to have best of show. And so the other 2 people were blind, so but it was really incredible, you know. And we you know, we got to our booth, and there was a woman there, and she said, I spent the night in your booth. And that's never ever happened to me before, you know. I mean, it happens to all these famous Native artists, you know. You have like, say, like Nancy Youngblood, a famous potter. You'd see all these millionaires, you know, in sleeping bags like bums on the street waiting in front of her booth, you know, for a couple of days. And so for somebody to say they spent the night in our booth, I'm like, this is really incredible. So we, I kind of took on what my mom did, you know, taking pictures. So I took pictures of the sheep and all the shearings and, you know, all carding and spindling and everything. And every time we went up 6 inches, I took pictures of the piece. So I put it into a book, and she was really excited about it. So I handed her the book, and I you know, my ex-husband and my sister's husband were putting up the piece, you know, up on so people could see it. And then she came over and she's crying, you know, and she said to me, I don't care what you want for this piece, it's mine, right? So I didn't know what to say to her, but the night before, my sister Roseanne was saying, I'm gonna tell him I want $60,000, and I want this, I want that, I want, you know, she just had a long list of things she wanted, and she was gonna tell the buyer this, right? So I told her, go ahead, tell her what you want. And she just couldn't talk. So I, you know, put on a brave face, and I said, this is what we want. And then her husband came up from behind her, and he goes, how do you want it, cash, check? And then I couldn't say anything, but he flew us to Houston, Texas. He showed us where the rope was going to be, and he paid us in cash. But it won first place, first division, first classification, excellent in traditional weaving, and best of show. So, and it's the first time a textile had ever won the Indian Market in, at that time, 66 years. And then a first time a traditional art had won in like 15 years. So we're really, really, really proud of that piece. And then now, you know, when you read like books on Navajo weaving, they always say, in the winter of 1987, you know, people remember Navajo weaving, and that was the coolest thing, was walking into a trading post or a gallery, and the gallery owner or trading post guy would say, "You're the one who ruined Navajo weaving for us." Because of you, weavers are coming in and demanding more money for their pieces, so mission accomplished.
And that's a really good point that up to I think when the Navajos came back from Bosco Redondo, Navajo weavers had to depend a lot on trading posts to sell their weavings. And for my sisters to start marketing on their own and getting the money that they wanted in the first place. And one thing they also did get was visiting rights, because most often most weavers don't know where their weavings go. And to this day, we know exactly where this tapestry is at, and every now and then Barbara can go visit it if she wants. And so Barbara in our family has been the trailblazer, and she has gone on to win Indie Market on her own again with another Best of Show. She has also taken on other styles. Burnt Waters, the one that she's pictured with right in the middle, that's a burnt water, and all the dye there is natural dyed. The one on the right is a moki, and that's a design from the 1800s as well. And marketing is really different for Navajo weavings. Most people will just go to a gallery or a trading post to buy weavings, but a lot of we learned early on that we can control a lot of what we do if we sell it and market our own pieces. And one of the things that Barbara started doing was, in the Southwest, everybody knows about Navajo weaving. And when you tell somebody you're a weaver and they say, "Oh, I would love to buy something," well, that moki, she traded that for her son's braces. So that went to an orthodontist. And so you just don't know, how things work in the weaving world. And Barbara's always pushing herself to do something innovative. And last year earlier this year, she did those Barbie dolls. And those Barbie dolls were commercially produced by, I don't know who owns Barbie. Mattel. Okay. So Mattel came out with a Navajo Barbie, and she wove those rug dresses and the mantas and redid their hair and put real Navajo moccasins on them. And it became an innovative. They had to create another category for her for judging at Heard's Fair. So Barbara has always been the trailblazer in our family, because I think she broke down a lot of doors. She broke down a lot of barriers to us as weavers. Because when she started doing other styles, our mother and our aunts had a talk with her when she came home from Phoenix, Arizona, and they said, "You can't do that. You can't weave those other styles. We are Two Gray Hill weavers, and you have to just weave Two Gray." And she said, "I've been an artist in residence for 4 years at the Heard Museum, and she had to listen to flute music for 4 long years." She paid her dues. She said, I would like to weave what sells. And if my collectors want something, I'm going to do the best, and I'm going to do it. And that's exactly how she advanced her family. She's the one responsible for paying for college tuition for her former husband and both of her children. And we wove when we were kids, and but I took the another road to where I had 2 sisters that were accomplished weavers, and I really didn't like the marketing, so I told everyone, I'm going to go to college. When I get my degree, I'm never going to weave again. And that happened until my sister passed away in 1996. And in our family, she was the keeper of our family history. She was the keeper of our stories. She had a lot of stories from our paternal side and our maternal side. And now there was no one. And so I felt that was a responsibility to me and I returned back to weaving. And so I had been working for the government for over 25 years, and I finally let go of it in 2010 and really concentrated on our history and also documenting a lot of things, and which one of it is the result of the book that we'll present to you later on. And so when I started taking up weaving, I didn't want to just do a weaving. I also wanted to know where it came from, what the history is, why did we weave with red? I could do like a regular mochi, but I wanted to have a statement. I'm well aware of what goes on today in the political world, and sometimes I say it with my weaving. And the mochi on the right-hand side was a result of a class that a niece of ours took, and she was 18 years old when she took the class. And there was a collusion of religion on the Navajo Nation very early on, I think the early 1900s, and that resulted in a lot of Navajos going through the religious route, and some stayed with tradition. And so we were talking to her about the creation stories, especially about Spider-Woman. And her statement, at age 18, she said to us, "I don't believe that. I believe that the Christianity route of how the world was created." And we were a little bit stunned and a little bit sad about it, but it's not our place to correct her. And I thought, how are other young Navajos feeling about this, especially the families that have gone the Christianity route versus the family who stayed traditional? And so for me, I wanted to take an old piece, a mochi, and put the Big Bang in it. Like, I believe in science too. I believe that evolution was, I believe in evolution. I also believe in our tradition. And so I put the Spider-Woman crosses in there, because I think we live in a world where we have to be lenient and we have to be tolerant. And so that was my shout out. And I put it in an exhibit in Idlewild, California. And one of our current students came in, and he looked at it, and he has a couple of Barbara's pieces, and he looked at it and he looked at it and walked over to me, and he said, "Who did that weaving?" And I said, "I did it." And he said, "Wow, that really looks like the Big Bang to me." And I said, "Walk up to it and look at the title." So he did, and he turned around and he was like, "I've got to have this rug." And so, our pieces always seem to go to the right people. And he's a nuclear scientist, yeah. So it's real interesting how when you go back into history and you learn about something, you can weave it, and your weaving tells a story. And so because of the history part, I started going back into figuring out about dyes, because our family is not, we don't dye our wool. And the reason why is because in the Two Gray Hill area, these are Two Gray Hill design elements, but there's color in it. And from 1941 to 1957, there was a trader there by the name of Willard Layton. And this Willard Layton is the one who hired our father back in the late 1940s. And so our father was then given the task of running the store, the day-to-day operations. He was also responsible for buying rugs and selling rugs. And also during that time period, Willard Layton loved color. So he handed out dye packets to the area weavers. And so they used the turquoise, the red, and the yellow. But all of those were acid dyes. They weren't natural. And so I wanted to use them, but I wanted to see if I could find natural colors instead of acid. And so I went on a mission to find these colors, and because I thought if the Two Gray ages, I wanted the colored dyes to age along with it without being so different from the natural. And I found natural colors, and I started doing a whole series of Willard Layton. And when we were on this book assignment, we ran into other weavers from the Tugre Hills area that were doing the same thing. So it wasn't like I was the only one that's really a big fan of history. So we go into a little bit of the Navajo weaving history, and I don't know if you are aware of Dr. Ann Headland. She's written a lot of books, and she held a couple of weavers conferences, and in one of the weaving conferences she presented a paper on some fragments of a Navajo dress woven with plant material, and it was carbon dated to the 1400s, and it was definitely a Navajo dress design on the woven piece, and she had it in a plastic bag and she sent it around to all the Navajo weavers that were in there. And that kicks out the whole notion that we learn how to weave from the Spaniards when they made contact. And so, you know, that has been written in a lot of books. I don't know when the retraction is going to be made, but we definitely had weaving prior to the 1400s. We also have a period in history, and I also participated in another book on the crane collection, and this was written by another weaver and I, D.Y. Begay, and two textile scholars. And when we were going through a lot of the textiles at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we were finding a lot of wording that were put on the labels. DY and I had a little bit of trouble with the labels, because the labeling period for one textile period is called the Serape period. Navajos call it the slave period, and we call it during the slave trade. And we know from our history that Navajo weavers were targeted for kidnapping, Navajo weavers and their children, and they were put into the conquistadors' household to unravel floor loom blankets that they had made. And Navajos had a style that made the weavings watertight, and they made functional pieces. So they made serape, they redid their designs, but they made them better. And so there's a whole history of that, but it's been mislabeled the Serape period, and the Navajo weavers, we call it the slave period. And so we, through that slave period, this dress was introduced. The Navajo people wanted Navajo weavers home, and so they made these dresses in red and black so that it would camouflage them when they would escape. And the dresses were always made with at least 4 lines to remind the weavers that they need to be back home within the 4 sacred mountains. And nowadays, people don't weave or wear a lot of the traditional red and black. A lot of the younger people, when they graduate from high school or from college, they have weavers make their dresses with mascots and school colors and things like that. But we shouldn't forget our history either, and what a struggle it was to return home. And so I mentioned a little bit of Bosco Redondo. That happened in 1863, and during that time period, Abraham Lincoln was the president. And there was an executive order to round up Navajo people and a lot of other tribes. They went through that same thing too. So there were the earlier presidents, a lot of them had termination acts for American Indian people because we were in the way of settling the settlements that were going to happen. And so the Navajo people were rounded up by Kit Carson from the Army, and the last stronghold of it was in Canyon de Chelly, and that's where our paternal grandfather is from. So we have stories about Bosco Redondo from our grandfather's side. And the Navajos were rounded up and held at Fort Defiance, Arizona, and then there were 4 separate marches, and each group marched over 400 miles over 52 days to get to Bosco Redondo, and that is Fort Sumner right by the Texas-New Mexico border. And there were a lot of people who died on the way over, and a lot of people died on the way back. And as Navajo people were marched through towns, children were kidnapped from their parents for slaves. And while there was no shelter, and they had to build shelters for the cavalry that was there. And during that same time period, Navajo weavers still wove. And they wove those early blankets that we call chief blankets. And those blankets were woven for trade items. And a lot of those first phase, second phase, third phase blankets ended up in the east because that's where the cavalry people were from. And so now when we watch like the Antiques Roadshow and we see these wonderful pieces come up, nobody ever mentions the weaver. Nobody ever mentions what the time period might have been. They seem to gloss over that and jump right into how much is it worth. But for us, it's important to remember our history, that Bosco Redondo create a lot of us are still here today because weaving still continued in the worst conditions. And so when the Navajos came back and resettled in the homelands, the regions kind of split up, and they were more or less inundated with trading posts. And there were, in its heyday, there were about 271 trading posts. And those trading posts dealt with Navajo weavings, every single one of them. The top right is the Tugre Hills, that's where we lived. And there were sometimes really good trading post people that championed weavers, and then not so good people. So there's a long history of them exploiting weavers. And one of the ways that they exploited weavers was this. People had to eat, and so they went to the trading post and they bought groceries. And if they didn't have any money, the traders developed a credit account for you, and they would write down what you bought that day. And as the month ended, they would add 400% interest on what you bought. And 2 months down the road, if you brought in a weaving, they would take the credit account, wipe out a little part of your debt, and give you would be lucky if you got $10 out of it and another box of groceries that went on your next month's bill. And it was only until the 1970s that the law caught up with them and made it illegal, which is now why there's less than 10% functional trading posts, because a lot of them were there to exploit Navajo people, and especially the weavers. And when the Navajos came back from Bosco Redondo, they were each given, the people who had livestock before, they were each given at least 60 head of livestock, and that could be horses, cattle, or sheep, and a lot of them had sheep. And by the 1930s, the Navajo people were very prolific in raising sheep and getting their herds together. And then, of course, the drought happened, the depression was going on, and the environmentalists and the scientists said the land was overgrazed. Now, when the Navajos were gone for a long period of time, people neglected to say that there were commercial ranchers that were grazing the Navajo Nation because there was nobody there. So they also were responsible for decimating the grasslands and everything. But everything in history says it was the Navajos who committed that without replenishing the grasslands. And so the order was given for the authorities to come in, and most often those government workers were men. And Navajo people are a matrilineal tribe. So the women are in charge of a lot of things. We own all the livestock. We are responsible for the children. We are responsible for the land base that we're on. And so when the feds came in from Washington, they only wanted to deal with the men. They didn't want to deal with the women who owned the livestock. So the decision to slaughter over 3 million sheep was a decision made by men, and no decision was given to women to save the animals. So what that did to weavers was it wiped out their incomes, and now we had to rely on traders bringing in wool from Pennsylvania, from Germantown, and they were bringing in other wool from other mills. So now the weavers had to buy their wool in addition to trying to sell it. And that really left a lot of people in a poverty-stricken cycle that they couldn't get out of. And when Barbara and I were doing the interviews, and there are about 4 women in their 80s in this book, and each one of them brought up the livestock reduction and still cried. And this is, this happened in the 1930s, and it is 2018, and they still remember it as painful as it was back then. And so, through it all, I think Navajo weavers have found strength in Spider-Woman. That's who gave us the gift of weaving. And so we are resilient, and we are always looking to the future. We have to teach our weaving to all Navajo people, whether they are our family members or not, which is why Barbara and I are teaching. We have taught for 20 years because we really believe that all Navajo people should learn how to weave. And we credit it all to Spider-Woman. And in our own weaving, of the 2 Great Hills that we do, we have a line that we weave in, and that line is our homage to Spider-Woman, and we call it the Weaver's Path. It's a spider. It's like a spider web that leads out and then comes back in, and that's to lead us to the next rug and to the next rug, and just like Spider-Woman, we leave our web everywhere, and so. Also Spider-Man, not the comic book hero, this is the Navajo Spider-Man. Spider-Man and Spider-Woman were tasked with learning by the holy people to teach the Navajos how to weave. And so Spider-Man is the one credited with producing the first loom and making the tools so that Spider-Woman would be able to learn the process of weaving. And that is carried on by my husband Belvin and by our nephew Terry. And they make looms and tools, and Belvin actually is a mechanical engineer by trade, so he figured out a way for our looms to be collapsible and adjustable, and he's brought us a long way to what we do now. And so even though our looms and our tools have evolved from 1920, the weaving on my left is a weaving by our grandmothers, Susie Tom and her mother, our great grandmother Danette Suibitsit, and to the rug, to the tapestry that is pictured on my right in 1996. The process is still the same. The looms have changed, the tools have gotten better, but the process is still the same. And we get asked this all the time. How long does it take? So I'm just going to show you what Barbara would make if she was the one selling this piece. So Cougar Hill tapestry, a weft count of about 120 per inch. If you're weaving a 3 foot by 2 foot wide tapestry, and tapestry is different from rug. There's blanket quality, there's rug quality, and there's tapestry quality, and we weave tapestry. It's a high weft count. So if you had to shear the 2 sheet, depending on how cooperative they were, it might take 4 hours. So we go down to like the weaving hours, 2,000. And how long would it take? 2,321 hours or 9 to 11 months. And the cost of this would be about $25,000. And now we have to market it, we have to take it to art shows, and those aren't free. Plus we have to pay taxes, and that's another curiosity factor with us, is that a lot of people assume that Indian people don't pay taxes, and we pay taxes. We don't get around that. And the net total of it would be about 25 for Barbara, and if you break that down, it's about $8.83 an hour, which is below minimum wage. And so a lot of people look at that and they go, oh, why do you weave? But just remember that we have about 5 or 6 standing all the time. So it's not like we depend on one weaving for the year. It does take us, we do finish a variety of tapestries within 1 year. And so we also And because weaving has been in our family for 5 generations, we now have 6th generation and 7th generations that are weaving, and we are teaching classes of Navajo people, and we promote education. We think it's a responsibility to us to teach people that what they've read in books, what is not spoken about, we should be able to tell everyone. And that's one of the things that when Barbara met Lynda Ligon in Peru, Lynda Ligon owns Thrums Publishing, and she used to own Interweave Press, and she has all these indigenous weaving books out, and she didn't have one in the United States. And so when she met Barbara, she said, "The United States is in my backyard, and I don't know why we don't have a book there." And Lynda also didn't realize that, you know, she lives in Loveland, Colorado, and I live in Denver, and we live less than an hour apart. And so it was only natural that we all got together in Denver to discuss what this book would look like. And right from the get-go, Barbara and I said, we don't want any outside voices. And it's a joke that when Navajo people came back from Bosco Redondo and there were multitude of books written by them, they were all written by non-natives. And it's that non-natives' perspective, their views on life that has been pressed on to the Navajo people and their lifestyle. And most often the two aren't compatible. And so when we were talking to Lynda, we said, we want to write the book. We don't want a translator. We talk Navajo, we can talk to the elders, we can talk to the youth, we can listen to their stories, and we're gonna write it. And so she let us. I mean, that's she was very lenient when it came to us telling our stories. And we travel from one end of the Navajo Nation to the other, from the north to the south, from the east to the west, through every kind of weather imaginable. And we were able to find houses in rural areas so remote that we couldn't figure out how could they live here. And the worst time for us finding someone was in an apartment complex in Flagstaff, Arizona, where it took us almost 2 hours to find an apartment. And so and we had a really great time talking to the weavers, and we picked weavers that you wouldn't necessarily know. Because there are a lot of famous weavers. There are some excellent weavers out there, but we kind of wanted to focus on the weavers that have been forgotten. And we wanted to highlight some elders, and some of their children are real famous weavers, but we wanted to focus on people whose story that we hadn't heard before. And that was one thing that my sister and I really wanted to highlight was that even in our own family, we interviewed 2 elder aunts, and we were shocked to hear their stories as well, because we thought we know them, we grew up with them, we know everything there is to know about them, but we really didn't. And I interviewed her children, my niece and my nephew, and there was stuff I didn't know, and I'm like, really? And so, it's a book that we're really proud of, and we hope that the trend continues, that we tell our own stories. And we best, we know the language, and so we don't have to rely on translators. There's nothing lost. And we hope that there are a dozen more people like Lynda Ligon, the Thrums publisher, to let people, especially in the indigenous world, to tell their stories. And I think that you as students, we welcome the chance to, there's a lot of collaboration that should happen. And diversity is one thing that has been sorely missing for a long time. And I think currently, as things happen in the world, there's a lot of division that happens. But I think art heals. I think art and our art, your words, your everything that you learn, it's an opportunity to learn about each other as well. So with that, I thank you. And if you have any questions.
I think we have time for a few questions. Antonia?
Sure.
Hi, I was just wondering if the breed of sheep for the Two Hills weaving is particularly important. I was really
Yes.
captivated by the
Yes.
palette and the possibility that you could have natural colored just wool
Yes.
undyed.
It does matter, and we don't use churro. We don't use churro in our Two Hill weavings because this is an example of weavings that Barbara did, and this is one that her son did, Michael. And because of the high weft count, we use a combination of Rambouillet and Merino breeds. And they're not real greasy, they're not full of lanolin, and so we can get a real high weft count on it. The churro is making a comeback, and we think that's a good thing for a lot of weavers that do functional pieces. A lot of them do like floor rugs, they do blankets, and there's a lot of younger people weaving, a lot of younger Navajos weaving, and a lot of them are going back to the old style of weaving, and they're using churro, and they're doing their own dyes, and I mean, there's a resurgence that.
They're doing a lot of research
Yeah, they're
about colors and designs, and it's really interesting. Just really young people interested in stuff like that. You know, we're gonna teach a class at the Herd Museum in November, the end of November, and it's just gonna be Navajo students, and we're just gonna be teaching the history part of the weaving. We're gonna have them, warp a loom and tell them the stories behind each piece of the looms and stuff. So it's gonna be really a different class.
Yeah. And as a test, we did a class a year ago with young people as well, young Navajos, and we threw out some weavers' names, and they didn't know who they were. And I was like, such a shame, because these are some of the weavers that broke down some doors, so we're thinking that maybe we could do like a baseball card thing of weavers and put their stats on. Yeah, because they should know. Yes.
Back to again the churros. Aren't all the pre-Bosque pieces pure churro because those were the
No.
sheep that were originally there? No, that's a myth.
A lot of them are not they're not all churro. A lot of them are belletas, which means they were product. They were either blankets,
Yeah.
long johns, or whatever that they traded for, and then they just unraveled them. So it's wool actually that were imported from two places. They were either imported from England or they were imported from India. The one that came from India, the unraveled pieces, the dye didn't penetrate because it was dyed after product was made. The one from England, the wool was dyed before it was made into product. So we get the clear reds from pre-Bosco period, and we get the carded pinks and the bayeta, or the little stripes that you see, that came from India. And so that kind of wool, I don't know where it came from, but it wasn't churro.
But the white and the black and the brown and the indigo were all churro.
They were not churro. They were regular, because by I think by the 1960s, the churro was gone. I mean, they had mutated into a lot of the Rambouillet and the Merinos by that point. And so it was slowly kind of going away. So I think 18.
Yeah, I think the churros were like from a different part of the reservation.
Oh,
Like around Hubble's and around that
I'm talking
part.
pre-Bosque though.
Yeah,
Before Bosque.
before Bosco.
I think they were already on the way out, because you have to remember that the conquistadors came late 1400s. That's when the churro was brought in, and by early 1800s, I think a lot of the churro was already going out.
And do you have do you have pre-Bosque pieces for people to see
No,
on the reservation?
No.
That's a problem,
That
isn't
would
it?
that's hard to find.
So even in
Yeah.
the Navajo National Museum doesn't.
oh, there are some.
do.
There are some there. Yeah.
Do you just mention the peace fleece?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so Barbara and I did a class just last week in Harrisville, New Hampshire. And while we were there, we were introduced to Peace Fleece. And Peace Fleece, I had no clue what that was. But Peace Fleece was a company that was founded by Pete Haggerty and his wife. And back in the 80s, Pete wanted some sort of relationship with the Soviet Union. And so he was buying wool from the Soviet Union as a way of farmer-to-farmer interaction and to create a pathway to healing. And so after several years of doing that, he wanted to do the same thing with Native Americans. And he said, you know, he realized what history had done to a lot of Navajo people. And so he started buying wool from the Navajo Nation. And at the time that he started buying wool, wool was being bought by the wool market for 25 cents a pound. And he came in and he said, if you sell your wool to me, I'm gonna buy it at $1.25. And so, you know, he more than doubled the price of wool. And so he worked with a lot of farmers, a lot of sheep growers to improve the flock. And he did it for many, many years. That wool was brought to Harrisville, and they were mixed with other American wool to make knitting yarns. And so Pete and his wife wanted to retire, and then Harrisville, no one wanted to buy the company, and so Harrisville, who spun the wool, felt it was an important company that shouldn't go away. So they bought it. And they don't know breeds of sheep, they don't know what they're doing, but they're doing it, And so if you're a knitter, if you're a crocheter, a weaver, you know, Peace Fleece is a yarn to buy. And we're gonna be mentioning it more and more, and we're gonna look for ways to collaborate with them, because I think when we do these classes, we'd love to say all of our students are using Navajo wool. And it takes companies like that to for collaborations that really lift up both you know, all communities. So that's a good thing for Peace Fleece.
I think maybe one more question, if anyone has. Well, they might be around for a few
Okay,
minutes.
yeah, alright, that's fine. Okay, yeah, if you wanna come up and take a look at this, you're more than welcome to. And then Barbie can tell you if she wants to. If you have a question about her pieces.
Thank you.
Thank you.